A girl sent from a border territory to embroider a sacred cloth and go home when it was done. That was the arrangement. That was all she was supposed to be. But she carried a secret no one knew she held. And he was a cursed king, cold as the granite walls of his fortress, feared by every court in the north. No one dared stand too close. On her fourth night behind those stone walls, she heard her own name spoken in the dark, whispered between shadows who had already decided her fate. She would finish the cloth, then she would disappear. And the king? He would never know she existed. They never expected her to stay. They never expected him to notice. But the moment his eyes found hers across a frozen courtyard, something shifted. Something the conspirators had not accounted for. So why, in the middle of his own great hall, did the most feared king in the north drop to one knee before a girl they called just a seamstress? Watch till the end. This story will surprise you. The needle caught the candlelight as it passed through linen, in, out, each stitch so precise it left no mark of effort, only the finished thing. A vine of frost flowers climbing the hem of the curse cloth's eastern border. Embla Valmont had been embroidering since she could hold a needle. She did not need to think about the work. That was the problem. When the hands were occupied and the mind was not, sound filled the space in between. The sewing room assigned to her sat flush against the great hall's western wall. The architects of Nordval's fortress had built the place in an era that valued function over privacy. The granite blocks were old, fitted dry without mortar in the old Germanic fashion, and where two walls met at the corridor corner, a narrow channel of air ran straight through the stone like a vein. Sound traveled it the way water found a crack. Quietly, completely, without permission. She had noticed it on her second night. She had ignored it on her third. On the fourth night, she heard her own name. The Valmont girl. Conrad's voice. She had heard it only once, at the fortress gate when she arrived. But it was the kind of voice that left an impression. Low, deliberate, wearing the settled weight of a man who had given orders for 40 years. She arrived with the cloth and the skills to complete it, nothing more. Embla's needle slowed. She is already a complication. The woman's voice was softer, but no less certain. Lady Seraphine, the one with copper hair and eyes like polished river glass, who had looked at Embla across the courtyard, with the particular expression of someone cataloging a threat. She has been seen twice in the library. Brother Oswin speaks well of her. The king notices nothing yet. He will. That is precisely what I am telling you. A pause. The fire in Embla's small brazier ticked. She came to weave a cloth, Conrad said. She is a piece of fabric exchanged for peace. When the cloth is finished, she goes back to Valmont, or she disappears quietly before the king begins to notice what she is. Either way, she cannot be here when he turns 27. And if the cloth does what the old texts claim, then Seraphine will be the one who completes it. The voices moved away from the wall. Embla sat in the quiet that followed, her needle held still between two fingers, the unfinished vine frozen mid-climb. She did not move for a long time. The brazier ticked. Outside, wind moved through the granite passes of the Nordval Plateau with a sound like distant breathing. She looked at the curse cloth stretched across its silver frame, 2 months of work already woven into it. The complex geometrics of an ancient Frankish ritual pattern her father had copied from a manuscript he would not let her read in full. Just follow the map, he had told her. You do not need to understand it, only complete it. She understood more than he had intended. She set the needle down flat on the table. She looked at the cloth. She looked at the door. The north gate went unguarded until the 6th bell. She had noted that on her first morning, a habit bred into her by a childhood in a border territory, where knowing exits was the same as knowing how to breathe. She could reach it in 12 minutes from this room. She could be through the mountain pass before anyone discovered the empty sewing room. And then her father's borderlands would burn within the month. Aldrich von Nordwall did not negotiate broken treaties. That much she had learned not from Conrad's overheard conversation, but from the expression on every soldier's face when his name was spoken. Not fear exactly, but the particular quality of attention that a man inspires when everyone in the room is aware that he is never, under any circumstance, bluffing. Embla picked the needle back up. If I am only a piece of fabric, she thought, making the next stitch, then I will be the piece they cannot cut. She worked until the 5th bell. The frost flowers climbed, and she kept their secret, and she did not look at the door again. 12 days passed in a particular kind of silence. Not empty silence. Nordwall was a working fortress, always full of boot falls and armory clatter, and the distant call of guards changing watch. But the silence around Embla was the cultivated kind, the kind that required effort to maintain. The other ladies of the household looked through her. Mira, the dark-eyed woman appointed to manage Embla's rooms and meals, delivered food, collected trays, and spoke only when spoken to, and even then said as little as possible while still being technically responsive. The serving girls moved around Embla the way water moved around a stone, present, constant, and refusing all contact. She was used to being underestimated. She was not used to being erased. She worked. The curse cloth grew under her hands, section by section, the ancient pattern emerging from her father's cryptic map. The silver frame her family had sent with her caught the morning light and split it into small, cold prisms on the stone floor. She studied the old manuscripts Brother Oswin had allowed her to borrow, cross-referencing the ritual symbols against the Germanic texts she could half read, and the Frankish ones she could read fluently. She ate alone. She slept briefly. She did not let herself think about Conrad's voice in the dark. On the 14th morning, she went to the small balcony off the sewing room to match thread colors in natural light. The amber and the wheat gold were nearly identical in candlelight, disastrously different in sun. And she had already made the mistake of pulling the wrong one twice. She was holding 2 skeins up toward the gray northern sky, squinting, when the sound from the training yard below resolved itself from background noise into something specific. She looked down. The yard was perhaps 30 feet beneath her, a broad square of packed earth and stone, flanked by the fortress's southern wall on 2 sides. A group of knights were working through formation drills, the rhythmic clash of practice swords carrying up clearly in the cold air. And at the center of it, in a plain white shirt with the sleeves pushed to the elbows despite the temperature, no armor, no ceremony, no accommodation to the audience of soldiers watching from the sidewall, was Aldrich von Nordwall. Embla had seen him twice since arriving, both times at distance. Once from a window, his dark head moving through the courtyard below. Once at the end of a corridor, his back already turned. The kingdom's women, according to Mira's few voluntary sentences, called him the Frost King without irony. The soldiers apparently called him something considerably less poetic and considerably more accurate. She had formed an impression of power, which was unavoidable. She had not yet formed an impression of him. Now she watched him work. He moved like something that had never wasted a motion in its life. Not graceful, exactly. Grace implied self-consciousness, a performance of ease. This was different. He shifted his weight, and the knight opposite him adjusted half a step too slow, and he was already past the guard and had the practice sword at the man's throat before the parry even began. No flourish. No pause for acknowledgement. He stepped back, reset, and the next man came in. The one detail that did not fit was the laugh, brief, sudden, almost reluctant, when a knight twice his width overcorrected on a feint and sat down hard in the dirt. Aldrich reached down without thinking and pulled the man upright one-handed, still laughing, and said something that made the entire yard grin. Embla did not realize she had been standing still for several minutes until the cold finally reached her fingers. She was about to step back inside when he looked up. No particular reason. No sound from her direction. Perhaps the same instinct that had made every soldier in the yard aware of where he was at all times. a gravity, a center of attention, something that simply did not allow itself to be unnoticed. He looked up, and his eyes, gray as the granite walls, gray as the January sky over the passes, found her on the balcony directly and without searching, as though he had known she was there. 3 seconds. The distance between them was 30 feet, and the whole architecture of their arrangement, the treaty, the cloth, the whispered plans in the dark, and neither of them moved. Then Embla looked down at the thread skeins in her hands, turned, and went inside. She placed the amber thread on the left, wheat gold on the right. Her hands were perfectly steady. She did not hear him return to his drills, but she thought about the way that look had contained no particular expression, no warmth, no coldness, no readable assessment, only the fact of noticing, as though she was something that had now been marked in a map he carried internally, its position noted for future reference. She worked until dinner. The frost flowers did not care what she thought about. The library encounter happened 3 days later and was entirely Brother Oswin's fault. The old monk had offered to show her the archive's collection of Germanic embroidery maps himself, and then had been called away at the door by some monastery matter, and had told her that she was welcome to continue on her own. He had then closed the door behind him, with the contented finality of a man who had resolved the problem to his own satisfaction. Aldrich was already in the library. He was sitting at the far table with a book open before him and a single candle lit, which suggested he had been here long enough to need no ambient light. He knew the space well enough to move in it without ceremony. He did not look up when she entered, and Embla registered his presence in the same instant she registered that the door had just clicked shut behind her. She made a decision in approximately a second and a half. She was a royal embroiderer who needed specific reference materials, and the library was open to her by royal word. She was not going to leave. She crossed to the shelving without speaking. He read. She scanned the spines of the lower shelves methodically. The archive system was genuinely peculiar, organized by some principle she had not yet decoded, while the candle on his table pushed their 2 shadows large against the stone walls. The embroidery maps were on the top shelf. She could see the binding, a narrow volume in dark leather with the Nordval crest stamped in faded silver. It was approximately 8 inches above what she could reach. She was not going to ask him. She pulled a footstool from beneath the reading table and positioned it, climbed, reached, and had 3 fingers on the spine when the footstool's leg caught a groove in the floor and tilted. She caught herself on the shelf, which held, and stood still for a moment with her heart making considerably more noise than it had any business making. When she turned, the book was on the table beside her. He had moved from his seat, retrieved it from the shelf in the time it had taken her to stabilize herself, set it precisely within her reach, and returned to his chair. He was already reading again. He had not said a word. He had not looked at her. He had simply noted and resolved and continued. Embla stood with her fingers resting on the leather cover of the embroidery map and felt something she did not have an immediate name for move through her chest like a note struck on a cold bell. She picked up the book. She sat at the opposite end of the table, far enough that their circles of candlelight did not quite overlap. They worked in silence for an hour. When she rose to leave, she said, "Thank you." He said, without looking up. She walked back to the sewing room in the dark corridor and did not look at the frost flowers she had embroidered for a long time. The great cold came without warning on the 15th night of her stay. Embla would learn later that this happened every few years in the Nordvale Highlands, a temperature drop of 20 degrees in 6 hours, driven by some combination of mountain wind and atmospheric pressure that the fortress's oldest inhabitants called the breath, and greeted with a particular resigned pragmatism. Window shutters were closed, extra braziers were lit. The outdoor water troughs were brought inside. Nobody told Embla. She was carrying a bundle of reserved silk thread from the storage floor to her room, a task she had taken on herself because Mira was already stretched thin managing the general chaos of the fortress's cold weather protocol. When the outer corridor torches began to gutter one by one, choked by the sudden shift in air pressure from the closing shutters, and the passageway went dark in sections around her, like a candle being snuffed from a distance, she found a staircase. The staircase led down instead of up. By the time she understood she was in the subterranean level, the dye works and storage vaults that formed the fortress's cold foundation, the door behind her had caught in its frame, swollen slightly with the temperature change, and when she pulled, it held. The dyeing room was enormous, low-ceilinged, smelling of iron and old wax, and the ghost of 100 colors. The silk thread in her arms cost more than 3 months of a soldier's wages. The temperature in the sealed room was dropping with a speed that made her very aware of her own hands. She set the thread down carefully on the highest shelf, away from the stone floor, away from the damp, and went to work on the door. It did not move. She worked through her options methodically. The door, the small ventilation grate in the far wall, the ceiling beam she could perhaps reach if she stacked vats. She was 2/3 of the way through constructing a viable plan involving overturned dyeing barrels when she heard the impact from outside. Not a knock, the sound of something very large striking stone, with no particular interest in what happened to the stone. The door opened. Cold air pushed in first, and then him, filling the doorframe in a way that was not about size alone, but about how space arranged itself differently when he was present, as though the room recalculated its own dimensions. He was wearing a soldier's wool coat, open at the collar, his dark hair disordered by whatever wind had driven the cold through the passes. And when he stepped in and the torchlight from the corridor reached her, his gray eyes moved over her once in the quick, comprehensive assessment of a man cataloging damage. She was sitting on an upturned vat with her arms wrapped around herself, and her lips, she was fairly certain, at least 3 shades past their usual color. He crossed the room in 8 strides, which was fast, and she understood she was shivering harder than she'd realized when she tried to speak and could not immediately organize the relevant muscles. He pulled off the heavy wool coat, started to step toward her to put it around her shoulders, and then his hands actually touched her arms. The first deliberate contact between them, his hands on the fabric above her elbows, and she flinched with the cold shock of it before she could stop herself. He paused for approximately half a second. Then he pulled her into his arms. There was nothing elegant about it. It was the motion of a man who had assessed a tactical problem and was solving it. He was warm the way forge metal was warm, deep and thorough and radiating through wool and linen both. And she was too cold to have opinions about this, which was probably good, because her opinions might not have been entirely useful. She pressed her face against his chest, because there was nowhere else to put it, and felt his heartbeat, steady and unhurried, completely unconcerned. "You will not die in my dye works." His voice, near her ear, was matter-of-fact. He lowered himself to one knee, still keeping her against him, and held out one hand. Blue-white light gathered in his palm like concentrated cold, and then, impossibly, became fire. A small, controlled flame that sat in his hand as though it had always lived there, casting warmth in a 4-foot radius. He fed it with wood chips from the floor without ever letting his arm shift from around her. She had been told, in the abstract, about the alpha blood and its properties. She had not seen it demonstrated as casually as a man lighting a pipe. When she stopped shaking, he shifted, not pulling away, but adjusting, kneeling properly now before her rather than beside her, and he reached down to her boot, which had come half unlaced in her escape attempts. His hands, close now, moved with the same focused economy she had watched in the training yard. He worked the lace through the loops without looking up. She was looking at the top of his dark head and trying not to do so obviously. He finished the second boot, pressed the laces tight, and stood. The fire in his palm went out. He handed her the wool coat properly this time, and she put it on, and it was heavy and smelled of cold mountain air, and something underneath that was simply him. "The thread," she said, when she had located her voice. "I can see it." He crossed to the high shelf, picked up the bundle, and brought it to her, without any expression suggesting this was remarkable. Then he turned toward the door. She rose to follow, and as she did, the outermost skein of gold silk slipped free and rolled across the floor toward the drain grate. They both moved, she forward, he sideways, and their hands arrived at the skein at the same moment. He was still. She was still. His hand covered hers on the smooth rolled silk, large and warm, where she was still cold at the extremities, and the pressure of it was not much, barely anything, barely a touch. But the room went very quiet in her own ears, in a way that had nothing to do with the temperature. She felt him look at her. She looked up and found his eyes closer than she'd expected, gray and silver in the torch spill from the open door. And she saw, she was not certain she was not imagining it, something cross his face that he did not appear to have intended to be visible. Some small disturbance in the granite, there and then not there, like a stone dropped in deep water, the surface already settling. He released the skein and stood. "Go," he said. The single syllable contained no particular instruction beyond the word itself. Not unkind, only flat, as though he had used up his capacity for something, and the remainder was going toward walking. She followed him into the corridor. He was one step ahead. She did not see him stop at the corner before the stairwell, one hand flat against the cold stone of the wall, head slightly bowed, as though needing a moment before the next thing. She was already climbing. The assassin in the East Passage was a separate problem. They heard him before they saw him, a scrape of boot against stone that didn't belong to the fortress's rhythms, coming from the shadow near the servants' entrance to the sublevel. Aldrich's hand was on her shoulder, and she was in the wall alcove behind him, before she'd finished processing the sound. It was over very quickly. She watched from the alcove, the silver embroidery frame tucked against her chest. The assassin had been moving toward the sewing room, she understood, not toward her by chance. And she watched Aldrich work with the same quiet, absolute absence of wasted motion she had seen in the training yard. Except here, there was no practice sword and no pulled blow. 3 movements. The man was on the floor and restrained and not getting up. Aldrich turned back to her. He was not breathing hard. "Come," he said, in the same tone he might use to say the fire is lit or the gate is open. Then they went upstairs. The interrogation room smelled of cold stone and the particular tension of men who were not certain how much they were permitted to know. Embla sat in the chair against the wall. She had not been invited to sit, but she had also not been told to leave, and she had learned early in life that the most useful position was often the one you occupied before anyone thought to object to it. The King's Guard conducted the questioning with efficient, professional courtesy. The man on the other chair answered in the limited way of someone who had already decided what he would not say. He would not say who had hired him. He would say there had been an inside hand. Aldrich sat at the far wall and did not ask any questions. He didn't need to. The room's particular quality of attention organized itself around him, regardless of whether he spoke. And the man being questioned kept glancing at him with a kind of exhausted dread, as though the silence were more pressuring than direct inquiry. Once, during a pause in the questioning, Aldrich looked at Embla, not the cataloging glance from the training yard. Something slower, asking something she could not precisely decode. She held the look without flinching. She did not have any answers she wasn't willing to give. The questioning concluded without resolving the inside hand. The guard took the man away. Aldrich stood and moved to the table where a lamp burned, and in its light, Embla saw what she had noticed 20 minutes earlier, the line of dark across his right palm, where a shard from the passage's shattered lantern had caught him during the fight. He had not glanced at it once. She rose from her chair. "Let me see your hand." He looked at her. The expression was not quite skepticism, more the look of a man encountering an event outside his category system. He held out his hand. She took it in both of hers and turned it toward the light. The cut was clean, not deep, already clotting, but long, running from the base of his first finger to the heel of his palm. She went to the small cabinet she had seen a guard use earlier and found what she needed: clean linen, a clay pot of pine resin salve that was pungent and would do the job. She worked with her embroiderer's hands, which knew how to move precisely in small spaces without causing secondary damage. She pressed the linen to the cut, applied the salve with 2 careful fingers, began wrapping. He was watching her face. She kept her eyes on the wound. "Do you know," he said, his voice calibrated to the quiet room, something careful in it she had not heard before, "that this is the first time anyone has bandaged a wound of mine since my father died?" The sentence was completely flat, informational, not plaintive, which somehow made it harder to receive than any particular emotion would have been. She finished the last wrap, tied the ends, and looked up. He was still watching her. The lamp between them made his eyes look less gray, warmer almost, the silver in them picking up the gold of the flame. "Why did you not ask about the inside hand?" he said. "You've known there was one." She met his gaze. "Because I already know what I heard 3 weeks ago." Still, silence that was not empty, the kind that has weight and shape, that you have to hold up. She told him, not quickly, not dramatically. She told him what she had heard through the wall that 4th night. Conrad's voice, Seraphine's voice, what had been said about the cloth and about her. She told him because she had nearly died in his dye works, and she was not going to carry that particular secret as a private weapon. When she finished, he had turned away from her. He stood facing the door, his back to her, and the quality of the silence changed from something she could hold to something she was standing inside. "You knew this for 3 weeks," he said, "and you stayed. If I left, Valmont would burn. Only for that." She looked at the wrapped hand she had just finished tying, now resting at his side. At first, he did not ask what she meant. The question hung in the cold air between them, and she let it. When he turned, his face had resumed his habitual quality, the granite stillness, the gray composure. But something in the alignment of it was different than before. Something that had been closed was not entirely closed. "From tomorrow," he said, "the library is available to you at any hour. Tell the night guard your name." He walked to the door. She stood in the lamplight holding the remaining strip of linen and did not ask him to stop. The days after arranged themselves differently than the days before. Embla could not have explained it precisely. Nothing formal changed. She was still the royal embroiderer from Valmont, still residing in the small sewing room, still eating most meals alone. But the fortress seemed to have taken some information aboard and adjusted accordingly. Guards nodded when she passed. The kitchen girl began leaving an extra bread roll with the morning tray. Mira, who had spent 2 weeks communicating exclusively in functional monosyllables, cleared her throat one afternoon and asked, without looking up from the linen she was refolding, whether Embla preferred the amber candles or the white ones for the evening work. "Amber," Embla said. "The white ones give me headaches." Mira said nothing, but the white candles disappeared from the room after that. Aldrich began appearing at the door. The first time she assumed it was accident. The second time she noted it. By the 4th time she was no longer pretending to herself that she was not listening for his footfall in the corridor. A particular rhythm, weighted and unhurried, recognizable now the way a frequently heard melody becomes impossible to mistake. He never came in unless invited. He stood at the doorframe and looked at the cloth, or at her work, or at nothing in particular. And one day he said, not as a question, not as conversation opener, just as an observation delivered aloud, "You weren't at the morning meal." "I was working. I forgot." "You do that." "I suppose I do." He left. The next morning, Mira brought 2 breakfast portions. When Embla asked, Mira looked at the wall. "Routine adjustment," she said, in a tone that permitted no follow-up. On the 6th morning after the dye works, he stopped at the door and she said, "What do you need?" Which was the sensible question, except that she already knew he didn't need anything in the practical sense. He came to these thresholds with no agenda she could identify, beyond the act of arriving. "I'm checking whether you're still alive," he said. "I embroider. I don't generally come to harm from it." "Not generally," he said, with a particular flatness that on anyone else would have been a joke, and left. Mira, from the corner, made a sound Embla chose to interpret as a cough. 3 days later, Brother Oswin found something in the archive that changed everything. He brought it to Embla's sewing room himself, which was unusual. The old monk usually left manuscripts on the library table for her to collect. He set it on the workbench beside the silver frame, sat down heavily, and looked at the cloth. "There is a condition your father did not share with you," he said. She put the needle down. The text, a secondary Frankish manuscript that predated the version her father had used, specified what the primary source had left implied. The curse cloth was not a simple ritual object. It was a response mechanism. The embroidery pattern could be completed technically by any skilled hand, but completed in the ritual sense, the sense that would actually dissolve the ash curse, required something different. The cloth becomes whole only when the one who embroidered it places within it a thread soaked in the blood of the soul-bound pair, given willingly. If the embroiderer is herself the bound soul, the cloth will complete itself upon true recognition between the two. She read the passage 4 times. The silver frame sat on the workbench beside her, and the cloth on it was perhaps 2/3 finished. The frost flowers had climbed to meet a border of interlinked wolf heads. The center field, the most complex part, the field her father's map showed as blank, had not yet been touched. She thought about 3 weeks of overheard plans. She thought about Conrad and Seraphine and the inside hand that had not yet been named at the interrogation. She thought about a pair of gray eyes over a lamp, and the question only for that, and her own answer that she had not finished giving. She sent a message to Aldrich that evening, not asking for him to come. She asked nothing directly. She had learned the vocabulary of this place, which preferred implication to request. She simply noted that the library would be useful tonight, if the archive permitted it, and that she had found a relevant manuscript. He was already in the library when she arrived. The storm that sealed the library windows was a minor one. No great cold, just an ordinary Nordvell winter storm, the kind that made the shutters rattle and drove fine snow through the gaps in the stone and turned the fortress, briefly, into a very large, very cold drum. Embla was studying the secondary manuscript by the broad table. Aldrich was reading. She had stopped wondering what he read. He seemed to have worked through most of the archive at some point in his life, moving through subjects with the same purposeful efficiency he brought to everything, and the candles between them made the space feel smaller than it was. She had not yet told him what she'd found. She was working up to it. "You don't fear the dark," he said. She glanced up. He was not looking at her, or if he had been, he wasn't any longer. "I've embroidered too many nights to be frightened of it." A beat. Then, "What is Valmont like?" Not quite a question. A door, left partially open. She set the manuscript down. She told him, not the treaty language of it, not the political geography, but the specific and sensory. The kitchen garden her mother had kept, planted with herbs in an order that had some logic her mother claimed to understand, and no one else ever had. The way the summer light came through the hall's southern windows in the late afternoon and turned everything amber. The sound of the looms in the weaving house, which she had loved since she was small, because it was the sound of something being made. He listened. He did not perform listening, did not nod or make the conventional sounds of engagement. He simply directed his attention at her and kept it there, which was, she was discovering, more thoroughly felt than most people's active demonstrations of interest. When she had finished, the storm had eased slightly, and the candles had burned down a 1/4 inch. She shifted in her chair. The old manuscript stand was just slightly too low for long study, requiring her to hunch. And then he rose from his chair and crossed to the shelves. He returned with a reading footstool she had not seen before, older wood, higher than the standard ones, and set it precisely in front of her chair without comment, then went back to his seat. She placed her feet on it, the manuscript leveled. Her shoulders released half an inch of tension she had not been aware of carrying. She looked at him. He had opened his book again. She looked back at the manuscript. Outside, the wind moved through the passes. The candles burned. Her chest had taken on the quality of something that had been asked a question it did not know how to answer in the available vocabulary, and was therefore simply sitting with it, quiet and full, and uncertain of what it contained. She had found the footstool on the table when she returned to the library the following morning. Without the footstool itself, that had been moved to a corner, as though it had always lived there, and without comment from anyone. She did not say anything about it. Neither did he. Seraphine made her move on the 9th day after the dye works, which was perhaps inevitable. She came to the sewing room in the early afternoon, composed and copper-haired, and wearing a smile of the particular variety that contains no warmth anywhere in it. She admired the cloth. She asked about the technique. She noted, with the gentle accuracy of a woman who knew exactly what she was saying, that the central field remained empty. "Some say that section cannot be finished by a foreign hand," Seraphine said, examining the silver frame with her head tilted at a curious angle. "The old families would say it requires Nordvell blood, something only those of this lineage carry." "The old texts say it requires true recognition," Embla replied, without looking up from the stitch she was setting. "Which is not a bloodline condition." A fractional pause. "How thorough you are," Seraphine said pleasantly, and left. 3 days later, Conrad called a council. The Great Hall of Nordvell held 300 people without strain. That night, it held 240, which was every knight, lord, and lady of the fortress, plus the heads of the mountain clans who had ridden in on short notice, in the way of men who had been told there was a problem and had opinions about it. The vaulted ceiling disappeared into shadow above 1,000 candles. The stone walls breathed cold. Embla stood at the entrance, in the dress she had made herself. Valmont silk, embroidered with Nordvall frost patterns. Her own needle, and her own choice. The two cultures worked into a single fabric, whether they wanted to be or not. She had not been invited. She had also not been excluded. She had chosen to interpret that as permission. Aldrich sat the throne in the center of the far dais. He had not looked at her when she entered. Conrad spoke for 20 minutes. He was skilled at this. The careful language of a man who knew exactly what he was accusing and knew exactly how to accuse it in a way that sounded like concern. The girl from Valmont. The foreign hand on a sacred ritual cloth. The suspicious empty central field. The undue access to the king's spaces. "The influence," he said, drawing the word out like a thread being pulled from tight weave. Lady Seraphine presented, with graceful regret, a section of embroidery thread she claimed had been taken from the sewing room's wastebasket, and which, when held toward the light, showed a discoloration she described as the mark of southern witchcraft, used to corrupt the binding symbols. Embla looked at the thread. She had never used a spool of that color. "The solution," Conrad said, turning to the throne with the satisfaction of a man arriving at a conclusion he had written before the meeting, "is to remove the Valmont girl before the cloth is completed, destroy what has been corrupted, and give the task to Mira." The name came from the left side of the hall, not the dais. A young woman's voice, clear and steady. Mira stepped into the center of the floor. She was wearing her house uniform and holding a small cloth pouch, and she looked, Embla thought, the way a person looks when they have made a decision they have been working up to for some time, and are now discovering that actually making it is simpler than the anticipation had been. She told the hall what she had been asked to do. Watch the Valmont girl, report on her movements, note her interactions with the king. She said who had hired her. She said what she had reported. She said what she had seen in the dye works on the night of the great cold, when Embla had sat in the cold without complaint and set her first priority as protecting the silk that belonged to the cloth, and not the silk that had been woven into the dress on her own back. "I was paid for what I reported," Mira said. She set the cloth pouch on the floor in front of Conrad, with the sound of coin on stone. "I'm returning it." The hall was very quiet. Conrad began a sentence about reliability of servant testimony. He did not finish it. Aldrich stood. He did so slowly, which was worse than quickly. A deliberate unfolding from the throne that drew every eye and held them with the quality of absolute attention that the hall had been generating toward him all evening, but which he had, until this moment, not returned. He came down from the dais without hurry. He crossed the floor. He did not walk toward Conrad. He walked toward the silver embroidery frame that had been brought into the hall as evidence, and stood in the center of the floor, with the cloth stretched on it, the two-thirds finished pattern facing the candlelight, the frost flowers, the wolf heads, the geometric interlocking of Frankish ritual and Germanic symbol, and the empty center field, which had been empty when she began and was still empty, and which, as he stood before it, began, very slowly, to fill. It was not a dramatic light. It was the quality of illumination at dawn, the first gray brightening before there is any warmth, the sense of something returning from a distance. The gold thread at the border of the central field began to move, no hand upon it. The needle, threading itself through paths her fingers had not yet reached. The symbols that the old manuscript had called recognition marks traced themselves in stitches too fine for human work into the center of the cloth. Seraphine made a sound. Conrad's face had the particular quality of a man watching a wager he was certain of losing. Aldrich turned from the cloth to the hall, and his voice, when he spoke, was the quietest it had been all evening and the most carrying. "This is your evidence against her, Conrad. An object that is responding to her presence by completing itself." He moved, not to the throne, across the hall floor, directly, until he was standing before her, and Embla looked up at him and found his face at close range for the first time. The gray eyes and the dark, irregular features that the women of the court called beautiful, and that she had been studying in stolen increments for weeks, and that were, at this distance, startling in the particular way of things that have been held at careful remove. He took her hand in both of his. He turned it over. The right hand, the embroiderer's hand, the one with the small calluses where the needle grip had built up over years, and he raised it to the hall. "I told the council she was fabric exchanged for peace." His voice did not rise. It did not need to. "I was wrong." He pressed her hand against his chest, against the linen of his shirt above his heart, and held it there. She felt his heart beat, faster than it had been in the dye works, she thought. Perhaps she was wrong. The ash curse does not break through ritual. The manuscripts that matter say it breaks through this. He looked at her, not at the hall, just at her. "Embla de Valmont, you are not my tribute. You are not my seamstress." He went to one knee. The cloth behind him blazed. Not fire, but the quality of contained light, the whole central field completing itself in a rush of patterned gold, the recognition marks lacing through it like breath entering a body. "You are the one this kingdom has waited 3 generations to find." His head was bowed, his voice was steady. "Will you accept that?" She had not been prepared for the question, which struck her as unreasonable, given that she had been preparing for every other aspect of this moment since the 4th night in the sewing room. She looked down at the King of the North, kneeling on the cold stone of his own great hall, his dark head bent, and she understood that he was entirely serious, that this was not performance for the assembled court, that he would have said this in an empty room. She thought about a book placed on a table. A footstool moved without comment. a coat that smelled of mountain wind. Only for that? And her answer that she hadn't finished giving. She placed her free hand on his shoulder. Yes, she said. He rose. He was smiling. It was, she thought, watching it happen, a thing she had not seen before, small and sudden and almost surprised. It was the first time she had seen him surprised by his own face. In the hall, the old warrior Torin, who had stood neutral through everything, who had watched Conrad's maneuvers and Embla's quiet survival, and Aldrich's cold distance, with the level regard of a man who had served long enough to wait for the actual ending, went to his knees. The sound of it was the sound of a decision being made. After him, one by one, the hall followed. Conrad was arrested at the door before he reached it. Seraphine was escorted out by 2 guards who looked, Embla thought, quietly pleased with the assignment. Mira, from across the hall, was weeping with a kind of furious dignity, refusing to look at anyone while tears ran down her face. Spring came to Nordval the way it always came, tentatively, sideways, refusing to commit. The granite walls held winter long after the lower passes had opened. But in the second week after the Great Hall Assembly, Embla noticed that the east-facing window of the sewing room, which she had never been able to open because the ice in the casement track swelled the wood shut, had somehow been freed. She pushed it open and looked out at a slope of gray rock, on which, improbably, a scatter of yellow flowers had found purchase in the cracks. She went back to her embroidering. The curse cloth hung now on the great hall's south wall, complete, the central field blazing in morning light. The silver frame sat in the corner of the sewing room, empty, its work done. She had begun a new piece, smaller, private, for no ritual purpose. A simple rendering of a frost flower from memory that she was working on because her hands required occupation. Aldrich came that evening. He came in, which he had not done before, previously always the doorframe, always the threshold. He sat in the chair across the workbench from her, and leaned back and looked at the ceiling in the way of a man whose particular form of exhaustion takes the shape of stillness rather than collapse. "Are you all right?" she asked. His eyes moved from the ceiling to her face. "I think so," he said. "For the first time I can remember, I think so." She looked at her hands in the lamplight. The calluses, the small silver thread that had caught in the skin at her thumb, glinting. She reached into the small cedar box beside the frame and found the last length of gold thread from the curse cloth, the few inches she had kept when it was done, without knowing why. She held it. "In Valmont," she said, "when 2 people want to make a promise, not a contract, not a formal vow, but something private, they bind thread." She looked up at him. "It's a working person's custom. My mother taught me." He had straightened slightly in the chair. She looped one end of the thread around her own finger. She held out the other end. "What would you promise?" he asked. His voice was careful, in the way of someone managing a feeling that is larger than the available words. "That I stayed, not because of the treaty." She looked at him steadily. "Not only because of the treaty. That I stayed for—" She stopped. She let the remaining clause remain in the candlelit air between them, complete but unspoken. He looked at the thread for a moment. Then he reached across the workbench and took the end she was holding out, and he bound it around his own finger with a deliberateness that was wholly characteristic of him. The same attention he brought to a sword grip, to a bandaged wound, to sitting on a library floor and listening to someone describe a garden 1,000 miles away. He looked up. "I don't know how to make promises with thread." "You don't have to," she said. "What would you use?" He was quiet for long enough that she understood he was not searching for words, but measuring what he was about to say against some private standard of accuracy. "Everything I have," he said at last. "All of it." The gold thread between them caught the lamp. She looked at it, and at his hand, and at his face, and something she had been carrying, not quite alone, but carefully, as one carries a thing that might spill, finally found its proper place to rest. She did not move toward him. He did not move toward her. The distance simply ceased. In the morning, a messenger arrived from Valmont, her father's seal, a formal inquiry into the treaty's conditions, the polished language of a man who had sent his daughter north and was waiting to understand what exactly he had done. Aldrich received the messenger in the east courtyard, with Embla standing beside him. The gold thread was still on his finger. She did not think he had removed it, though she had not asked. "Tell Lord Valmont," he said to the messenger, in the level tone of a man conveying information, rather than making an announcement, "that the bloodcloth pact is dissolved." The messenger's face moved through relief, then confusion, then a careful diplomatic blankness. Nordval does not accept tribute from its allies. Aldrich glanced down at her. A brief thing, private, the kind of look that was not for public consumption and didn't care. "It marries their daughters." From somewhere behind them, across the courtyard, a very small but unmistakable sound emerged. Mira, who had apparently been within earshot, producing a cry that she immediately suppressed by pressing both hands over her mouth. The messenger recovered himself and bowed very deeply. The sewing room was different now. Larger windows, someone had replaced them without announcement, a full inch wider on each side, which doubled the afternoon light. A second chair had appeared, older and heavier, positioned at a reading angle to the window. The frost flowers Embla had been embroidering in the evenings were coming out better than anything she had made in Nordvale, which she attributed to the light. Spring, when it finally committed, came quickly. The way things come quickly in the north, all at once and without apology, the gray plateau suddenly threaded with ice melt streams running downhill in bright lines. The fortress learned, incrementally, how to be a place where more light was admitted. In the evenings, when the work was put away, Aldrich sat in the second chair and read. She sat in the embroiderer's chair with her work, and the fire in the grate was the same fire she had watched burn alone for those first 2 months. And it was different in a way that required no description. The way that all things are different, when the specific absence that had defined them is no longer present. The frost flowers in the cloth grew. Outside the window, small and stubborn, the real ones pushed through the granite's cracks. The fortress was learning to be warm. Nordvale, year of the dissolved ash curse. The curse cloth of House von Nordvale hangs in the Great Hall to this day. Scholars note that the embroidery of the central field differs markedly from the surrounding pattern. The stitches are finer, the gold thread brighter, as though worked by a hand more certain than the sections surrounding it. Some say the cloth completed itself. The embroiderer, when asked, has been known to say only that all cloth has conditions, and that the most important conditions are the ones no map includes. She arrived with a silver frame, a bundle of silk thread, and a name no one intended to remember. Embla de Valmont was not sent to Nordvale to matter. She was sent to complete a cloth, an ancient ritual object woven from patterns older than the fortress itself, and then to disappear back into the border territories she came from, quiet and unremarkable. Another piece moved across the board by people who believed they were the only ones playing the game. That was the plan. Clean, efficient. Cruel in the particular way that plans are cruel when they treat a person as a variable rather than a soul. But plans, like cloth, have conditions no map includes. On her 4th night in Nordvale, Embla heard her own name spoken in the dark. She was not supposed to hear it. The stone walls were old, the architects long dead, and somewhere in the fortress's ancient bones, a channel of air ran through the granite like a secret vein, carrying voices, carrying plans, carrying the shape of her fate laid out in someone else's words. She is only fabric exchanged for peace. When the cloth is finished, she goes back. Or she disappears. A lesser person would have run. She picked up her needle and kept stitching. This is the first thing the story teaches us. Courage is not always loud. Sometimes courage is the decision to stay in a room that was never built for you. To keep your hands moving when everything inside you wants to stop. To carry a secret not as a weapon, but as a quiet weight, and choose deliberately what to do with it. Embla did not run, because running would have cost her people everything. But she also did not run, because somewhere, beneath the cold arithmetic of survival, she had already begun to understand that this place, this frozen, granite-walled, myth-haunted kingdom, contained something worth the staying. Aldrich von Nordwall was everything his reputation promised, and nothing his reputation explained. Feared, deliberate, carrying the settled weight of a man who had learned, somewhere along the way, that the world was safer when he kept most of it at a distance. His court called him the Frost King. His soldiers called him something more direct. Everyone knew where the boundaries were, and everyone respected them. And no one, for a very long time, had thought to ask what it had cost him to build them. He was a man who had not been looked after since his father died. A man who placed books silently within reach, and moved footstools without comment, and stood at doorframes because he understood thresholds, understood the difference between being invited and simply arriving. A man whose laugh, brief, reluctant, almost surprised, appeared only when he wasn't thinking about it. He was, beneath the granite, entirely human, and Embla saw it. Not because she was looking for it, not because she had any strategic interest in what lived beneath a cursed king's composure, but because she was the kind of person who notices, who pays attention, not to what people perform, but to what they cannot help but reveal. The book placed just within reach, the coat that smelled of mountain wind, the heartbeat, faster than expected, in a cold stone room. She saw him, and something in him, long accustomed to being seen only as a crown, or a threat, or a problem to be managed, did not know what to do with being seen as a person. The curse cloth was supposed to be a ritual object, an ancient pattern, a technical problem for skilled hands to solve. It turned out to be something more honest than that. The old manuscripts, the ones Embla read because she needed to understand what she was making, because she had always been the kind of person who needed to understand the thing she was building, said that the cloth would only complete itself under one condition. Not blood of a specific lineage, not the hands of a court-appointed embroiderer, true recognition between the two. Which is to say, the cloth was never about the stitching. It was about whether two people could see each other clearly enough, honestly enough, to dissolve what centuries of shadow had built between them. The curse was never really in the bloodline. It was in the distance, in the habit of isolation, in the accumulated weight of choosing safety over connection, until connection begins to feel impossible. Embla completed the cloth not because her hands were skilled, though they were, but because she had already, quietly, done the harder work. She had looked at a feared and frozen king and refused to be afraid of what she found. She had stayed when leaving was logical. She had told the truth when silence would have been safer. And he, for his part, had knelt. Not for the court, not for the ritual, for her. For the fact of her, for the woman who had survived his fortress, his cold, his conspirators, and his silence, and had chosen, at the end of it, to remain. Here is what this story is really about. It is about the people who are sent somewhere to be used, and choose instead to matter. It is about the leaders who have learned to govern everything except their own loneliness, and what happens when someone refuses to pretend that loneliness is invisible. It is about small gestures, the ones that don't announce themselves. The coat left on your shoulders, the extra bread roll on the morning tray, the window quietly freed of ice, open to let in light that had been kept out for years. It is about the radical act of staying present in a room full of people who want you to be something smaller than you are. It is about recognizing that the most powerful curses are never really about magic. They are about isolation, about the stories we tell ourselves regarding who we are allowed to be, who we are allowed to need, what we are permitted to ask for, and about the fact that those curses, the real ones, the ones carried in the body and the habit and the long practiced distance, can only be broken by exactly what the cloth required. Not ritual, recognition, not power, presence, not the right bloodline, the right honesty at the right moment given freely. Embla came to Nordval as fabric exchanged for peace. She left as the woman who taught a frozen kingdom how to be warm. And the frost flowers she embroidered, patient, precise, climbing their slow path along cold stone, are still growing. Some stitches, once made, cannot be unmade. Some people, once seen, cannot be unseen. Some choices, made quietly in the middle of the night with a needle in your hand and a secret in your chest, change everything. That is the whole of it. That is the cloth, completed. If this story touched something in you, tell me, which moment got you the most? Was it the dye work scene? The Great Hall? Or something quieter than that? Your comments genuinely make me want to keep creating. Like, subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.